Hi everyone, it's Lennon and welcome to October's Mindsight. And as this is an October video, a face video, I'm dressing up as a bombshell today. I hope I can do it justice. Today, October's topic for Mindsight for me was deaths of all kinds. And I touch on this a lot. I seem to because I love the concept of talking about all kinds of deaths. Real death, spiritual death, ego death, and how they all may play a role in terms of my practice. And it started out last new moon when I put to bed the last Mindsight. I start researching and looking up things to do with the next month's topic. And so that's typically what I do from new moon to new moon. And it started me on a quest of mainly the spiritual death. And basically that just means death in a spiritual way, right? And then I wanted to touch on ego, but we'll get there in a second. Mainly what I wanted to focus on was, is this a possibility? Like, does it have anything to do with your actual practice? Does it have anything to do with what you do in terms of magic? Because there's so many witches out there and magical practitioners that don't put a lot of emphasis on like death aspects. So, and then there's on the other end of the spectrum, there we have like death doulas and witches and magical practitioners that do have a heavy emphasis on death. And then there's like me, I'm somewhere in between. I do have a death devotion, which I'll talk about in another video, but like I don't study death doula, death rituals like as like a consecutive once a month or every week kind of a thing. I don't do it that much. So anyway, there's that. But in terms of spiritual death, actually, when I was growing up in my family's branch of Christianity, there was always talk of a spiritual death, this thing that this separation we could have with God. That was like our spiritual death. And when we go through that, it will be like what I would call now the dark night of the soul, right? Now, the way that the preacher I had growing up, I think there was like maybe one sermon on this my whole life. And basically he just touched on the fact that when you separate yourself from God, the number one thing to remember is that if you deny him in any way, deny him of being your ultimate creator, that's the only way to go to hell. Basically, in my branch of Christianity, it was to deny that he even existed was the only like way to hell, right? But he went further into the sermon because sermons only last like about an hour here in the South. He went further into the sermon talking about how it's not just denial that would be the spiritual death. It could be the fact that us mere mortals, we have a tendency to want to be materialistic. And if we don't feel like we have questions regarding why we are here, because a lot of spiritual people ask that. That's why most start a spiritual practice, is like why we're here. And when you don't have that, when you do not have that like give a shit to find it out, that in and of itself is like you're spiritually dead, not a spiritual death, but you're spiritually dead. And I found that to be kind of fascinating when I was a teenager because the way, he was such an eloquent speaker. Most preachers are. They're just very good at public speaking. But he just was so eloquent in that sermon about being spiritually dead and how to seek spirituality again if it were truly dead in you, how to awaken it. And he gave some good points, but mostly it was like praying and Bible study and stuff like that. So I'm not going to go into that right now. I think at the end of that sermon, he talked about spiritual death, okay? How that happens is when you deny God. That's at that moment of your spiritual death. Being spiritually dead altogether, which means you have no give a shit to want to know why we're here. You just want to be materialistic and you just want to be on our earthly plane. You don't really have any questions related to divinity. That's being spiritually dead. And then he says that the only way to become alive a lot of Christians talk about being born again, is to find that in a practice with Jesus, right? Or in a practice with God, awakening to a new practice of God. Say that you're spiritually dead and you happen to visit a church with a friend of yours and it awakens something in you. That's being born again. And I feel like at the time of my spiritual death, it wasn't really a denial of God, to be honest with you. The death did not look like what he described. It just looked like I need to reassess what I believe in. That was it. I didn't want to say I didn't become atheist. I didn't even become agnostic. I started to like put forth things that I didn't feel comfortable with. I started naming them to myself. Like, okay, I don't feel comfortable with this. Well, these two Bible verses contradict one another. I don't like that. And once I started putting forth these concerns, the death was slow after that. It felt like it was a slow death, which was okay for me because it felt like that was okay. It was probably what I needed, because if I had just ripped that shit off like a Band-Aid, there probably would have been some more trauma involved with it, to be honest. And so my death was kind of like a slow death, and it was just more of me questioning what my spirituality looked like already, what I wanted it to look like over here, and somewhere in the middle, I started jotting down what I didn't like. That was it. And then I stopped going, right? Stopped hanging out with those people. Put my foot down as far as like what I wanted. Like I didn't want to be part of that anymore. And then what happened was I was able to build from just this base foundation, because I'd already had a foundation, because I had to be real with myself when I started getting uncomfortable with certain sermons. Now, in a whole separate mode of research that I have done into spiritual death, I wanted to also kind of touch on spiritual warfare, which there's death way at the end of this spectrum, the spiritual death way at the, side of this, way on this side. But then leading up to that, what I was talking about with asking myself and being true to myself, that felt part of the death, but that was like spiritual warfare. I was battling with myself about what I didn't believe in, what I wouldn't want in my spiritual practice, and stuff like that. So I felt like the warfare was like the battle I had ensued with myself to make the death come about. I just became a Viking, right? I just took all of the knowledge I had and scythed everything on the field away that I didn't need. So it wasn't really this part leading up to the spiritual death. This was warfare, spiritual warfare. I was looking at my sins. I was looking at the commandments. I was looking at the creation story. I'm so passionate about the creation story. I was looking at all of that, and I was at war with myself. Now, some things happened in that spiritual warfare time that would seem like what my mom would call the devil on my back. I've said this many times before. What that looks like is you start feeling like you have bad luck. That's basically what it is. You lose out, you lose a job, or, your car breaks down, and then the next thing you know, something happens in your house and you need a hot water heater, and you have to figure out if you need a hot water heater or if you need a new alternator in your battery, in your car. It's like, it just seems like a slew of bad luck, right? When you're in the spiritual warfare, it's like all the demons come out and want to fight you because you're susceptible now, because you don't have Jesus with you or some shit. But that's also a time for people that are susceptible to like psychics and mediums. They're susceptible to the dead. I feel like in terms of spiritual death and spiritual warfare, the spiritual warfare, that battle that you have with yourself before your spiritual death, before you cut everything and start building your own practice for yourself to benefit you, that's going to be when you're most susceptible to attacks, spiritual attacks. That spiritual warfare time, the battle time, you're on the battle. That's when all your demons, like I said, if you're a psychic or a medium, like demons, kind of evil entities will rise up and try to battle with you as well. And it's like you don't have enough on your damn plate already. But there's a place in the spiritual warfare, in my opinion, where that's the time you need to get servitors. Okay, even if this is completely in your imagination, there's things that you need mentally to battle yourself. And I believe that not doing any journaling, not doing any inner work is not serving you in the warfare. You're fighting a losing battle then. You have to have the mental and emotional strength to battle yourself, because it's going to be the hardest battle you ever do. So I feel like when in terms of talking about death, spiritual deaths, I think that it's important to note spiritual warfare as well. Now, like I said, in terms of my witchcraft, spiritual warfare is where these supernatural forces come out. But for me, when I am coming to the table at my practice and I am armored up, okay, to battle myself, looking like Joan of Arc, there are things that I have to be okay with. It's not a fight to the death per se. It's a fight for your rights. But I believe that the warfare before the spiritual death happens, I feel like in the time of warfare, it could also be a time of spiritual cleanse. Think about what witches and healers and whatever else, what do they do when they're battling with something? They use sage, they use anointing oils. Those are also things that you could do in that spiritual warfare time, leading up to your spiritual death. We have to accumulate all the tools that we need to fight ourselves. We need to figure that out. That's going to be a battle in and of itself. We're all alchemists on the hunt. And what are we on the hunt for? We are on the hunt for a spiritual practice that we can maintain, that will continue to grow, that's not locked in. We're not stuck in this box, right? We can keep changing it. We can keep going through cycles, but we have to continue to do the work. And it's going to be I feel like the whole thing is an ongoing battle. But we have to have the tools necessary to get the shit done. We have to have the armor. I don't want to say tools, but it's really the armor in which we is the armor in which we need to sustain the battle, continuing on the spiritual practice. The alchemists that we are, the hunt is for the Philosopher's Stone. But it wasn't a hunt, right? We're not Knights Templars looking for the Holy Grail. What the alchemists did was they had to build something. They had to take apart something and build it back up. We're those alchemists. Yes, we're on a hunt. Yes, we're in a battle, but they were in battle as well. They had to constantly take apart things to see if it would work with something else. And ultimate goal being the Philosopher's Stone. So I just want to put that analogy forth. Now, the last topic, the last death I'll say that I want to talk about is death of the ego. There are lots of angles we can play here, but I wanted to talk about death of the ego in terms of spiritual death and spiritual warfare, just because I'm trying to make this video as cohesive as possible. For me, death of the ego is just a self-surrender, but not a self that's separate from the ego, okay? I feel like the ego is like the outer shell of our self, right? This self that is the true us, and the ego is like surrounding it like an eggshell. What happens in an ego death? There happens to be like a transitional time for you, a transitional time that cracks out that eggshell, right? Stuff starts seeping out. The ego chips away because of something that we're putting it through. There's so many steps to an ego death that you have to take them all. And they have to all be important to you. Otherwise that the death comes in a way that's not going to benefit you. Because let's just say that I get rid of my ego tomorrow, right? It can't happen that way. I'm just saying. Let's say the ego just gets shredded tomorrow. then all is left is my true self. And what is that? I have not hard-boiled the egg yet. So inside is just the goo that is the true self. I don't know the true self enough to make it into a hard-boiled egg from the glob, right? From the glob that falls out of the shell. It's just this gooey mess of the true self, because the ego protects the true self. The true self is vulnerable, right? So in steps to get to the true self, you have to go through the process of hard boiling that egg. That way, when you do shed the ego coat, so to speak, there will actually be a firm egg there, right? That's the true self. Maybe the true self is the hard yolk. I don't know. However you want to put this analogy, put it. But I always think of the ego as a shell, but it's a very protective shell. There are things that the ego does to protect the vulnerability of the true self. And if we were just to wake up in the morning and say, you know what, I'm tired, this isn't really me, I'm tired of being humble to this, and I hate saying yes to this when I always want to say no, and you just crack open the egg, and the goo falls right down onto the table. That's your true self just laying there. There are steps, okay? I just wanted to clarify with that analogy that there are steps you must take in terms of an ego death. Don't just go all half-cocked and say, I want an ego death, because I don't think it works that way, especially in terms of protecting yourself. Say you're a CEO, okay, or something, and you've been climbing the ladder, you've been working hard, long hours, yada, 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 yada. And then all of a sudden you wake up one morning and you've lost your wife, and you get the kids every other weekend, but you can't really see them because you're a workaholic. And you wake up and you realize, who the fuck am I? This is not who I am. I did not start out. I didn't work this hard for this to be my life now, right? Let's just say. It's probably a movie or something. It's probably a whole bunch of movies. But that analogy is perfect for me, because I think, it's like a midlife crisis almost. They start wondering how it all went, where it all went wrong. And then you take the steps, probably without even knowing it. You take the steps to eradicate the ego, to get back to the true self. Usually in the movies, it takes like several steps of them finding themselves. And then at the end of the movie, they have, and they're better. They're so much better for that. Like I said, I do believe that the ego death is a way for us to raise the white flag, surrender to the true self, because I think that when we put the ego, and then vice versa, the ego puts forth onto us so much shit, we're, as much as we do with the ego, okay, as much as it protects us, as much as it thinks it knows better, there is still a level of thickening that shell of the ego. And we really just want it to be like an eggshell. We don't want it to be no thick ass crust, In spiritual death, I do believe that we don't have to necessarily eradicate the whole ego. We can just make it to where the crust around the egg is just thin like the egg yolk, or like the eggshell. Thin like an eggshell. We can just, with a spoon, and it's done. Not this hard shit that we need like one of them earth drills for. The point is for you to have an unbiased ego that's just waiting on you to crack it with a whip, crack it with a spoon, and pull forth like, Hagrid's dragon. So for me, ego death is, it can be a necessity depending on what your life looks like. There's still steps that you must take, because I feel like the true self is just a wrinkled old gooey mess that we think we know. The ego thinks it knows it, but there are steps to take to get back to that. And it'll be eye-opening to see the true self, because you're going to be like, well, I've been living like this. Well, yeah, that's because that's the ego. That thing, society, your parents, everyone else's opinion is all shielding you from seeing the real you. So I do think that it's sometimes necessary to get to the true self, but there are a lot of steps. And we're not going to go into the steps right now for the purpose of this video. But I just wanted to go over 3 things in this deaths of all kinds. It's not really deaths of all kinds. Death of the ego, spiritual death, and then spiritual warfare, this battle that ensues in us all when in all of them, we need to get to the true self, a true spiritual practice for you, a true picture of divinity for you. And then again, the true self in terms of the ego. Okay, now as this is a new moon, and I never really talk about the moons because it's all concentrated on my Mindsight, this journaling research thing I do every new moon. I do new moon rituals and spells, but I don't talk about them because that's just my personal preference. But because we're in October and we have an October 1st full moon and a Samhain October 31st full moon, I wanted to talk about the new moon. Because I believe that this new moon in October is a crux. We have 2 moons up here at the beginning and last of October, and then the new moon down here. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, refer back to my October 1st video, 2 full moons. Now, like I said in that video, I'm just going to sum it up for a second. There's full moon at the 1st, full moon on October 31st, and what I'm doing with them this month is I'm mirroring them. I'm using them as mirrors. I'm going this way with this mirror and this way with this mirror. Well, it makes sense that this new moon today, and I've already done some shit earlier, I needed to do something. Now, what I'm looking at in terms of this triangle is here's the new moons. Here's the full moons up here. I'm mirroring them through, I'm shining the spotlight like this. This way, this way. And then right here stands the new moon. So what would I do on the new moon? I would look at this as paths back to the full moon. As this is a new moon, you can't even see it. It's dark, right? There's some darkness in the new moon. But there's a way that we can pull the light of the full moons the full moon that we just had and the full moon that's coming up. We can gain some of that insight and some of that creativity. Now, the new moon is all about starting something. That's why I start a Mindsight every new moon. I talk about it, put it to bed, get the next topic out, and that's what I work on till the next new moon. That just happens to be a ritual that I have on top of whatever else I have to do those magical days. But the new moon is the what? New beginning. It's the first day of the moon cycle. A lot of shit happens with that. What I wanted to do this time is look back on what I did October 1st, right? Put some things to bed, and then find out, maybe I set, now the full moon isn't a time for me to set intentions. That's the new moon. So when I want to set an intention, okay, I can look at all the magic I did on the 1st and think about what I can do on the full moon on the 31st. I can look at it like this. And that's what I plan to do today in terms of the new moon. Write some goals and some intentions, but use the magic of the previous full moon with me to propel my magic that will happen on the 31st. I also like to set goals for the next cycle. Like tonight, in the crux of new moon magic, I will be writing down intentions and goals for the next 28 days. And really, I want to focus on the mirrors of the moons. I want to look at what I want to culminate on the full moon. I also feel that it's really cool having the new moon between 2 full moons, because then that kind of fills me with light versus dark. There's double light and then there's dark back here that could play like on my goddess work. This month being a heavily magical time anyway, this season of the witch, but also the moon cycle and what it's doing in this particular month. I may look at goddesses. I may look at how these 2 full moon goddesses could play against one dark, right? What would that battle look like? Having 2 full moon entities and then a dark force back here. Maybe look in terms of having this month have a little bit more moon deities, moon goddesses come forth as my servitors in terms of my spiritual warfare that will continue, right? So those are the things that I'm doing. Now, the activity for this Mindsight is we're going to look at some death cards in the tarot, because we're talking about death, right? And so in terms of spiritual warfare and death of the ego, I wanted to look at a few death cards and talk about them. So I'm going to turn the camera around. See you in a minute. Okay, so I'm back and I have accumulated a couple of death cards. I got the Thoth, I got the Rider-Waite, I got the Mother Piece card right here. I have the Black Shuck from the Forest of Enchantment Tarot, and my Vanborn. It's a Marseille. So this is like one of my top Marseilles of the older variety. So anyway, I've set up my little table here to display these particular death cards, only because I believe that they greatly relate to death of the ego, spiritual death, yada yada. Like we see the normal, I guess you could call the older version of the death card is this typical skeleton with the scythe and this agricultural like plane that he seems to be, you know, gardening. With the Thoth deck, we have a typical skeleton slash, I'm sorry, that's my dog walking around. Skeleton figure that happens to be like Osiris with his scythe and these bubbles in the waters in which he died. Then we have the Rider-Waite, which is death on a white horse, holding, of course, this black flag representing matter, and then the square of the flag being like the four corners would be the four elements, and then of course the five-petaled rose, which is the rose of the Rosicrucians, which means divinity. There's a whole bunch of shit happening in there. But one thing I did find was that the horizon, of course, is the horizon, the new horizon after the dark night of the soul, and then all of these figures actually mean something. This card right here, all the figures basically in the bottom of this card represent another card in the major arcana. We have the Hierophant Bishop here. We have this woman who is on her knees and she's kind of looking to me it always looked like she was like reverent but leaning back towards something or leaning away from death. But it actually could be the figure because she's crowned with like it looks like she's crowned with some kind of floral wreath. But that could nod back to the strength figure. This child could nod back or nod to the sun, the child in the sun card, or even the full card, this divine naivete that comes with the transition of death. And then this figure that seems to be dead is just the regular death of all of matter. I love the depiction in the Mother Piece because there is, of course, a skeleton present. The skeleton looks like it's in the fetal position, but there's a snake coiled around both the birch tree and the skeletal figure. It's almost like the skeleton is giving the figure in the fetal position a hug. The skeleton's not actually doing the work. It's the snake that is the central figure in this card. The snake is shedding its skin, right? So that is what is symbolizing the transition. The actual skeleton is representing the death that we go through in the ego, the death that we must face. And I think that the birch trees here, the birch trees here is a wonderful representation of matter and like earthiness because of the shedding that the birch tree does as well. And it all just seems to be like you see these like rich fall amber-like leaves falling off this birch tree as well. It could represent the autumn time of the year. This could be a Samhain card, again, fitting of the veil. There's a lot at play in this particular card. And then the shuck, the black shuck, I wanted to read something out of the guidebook. It says, of the otherworldly beings that dwell in the woods, few are as fearsome as the black shuck, for he is a portent of death. Now, a portent is a sign, like a casting of a prophecy. When black shuck appears, take it as a sign that you need to prioritize what is important and release what no longer serves you. Now, that is a great... I guess that's a great take. Now, for me, the black shuck is a figure in mythology that speaks on the fear of the dark night of the soul. It's kind of like Harry Potter with the Grimm, you know? It just signifies the fear that goes along with the unknown. And I thought that that's why I would pull this card out to, like, along with all the others, even though the other ones are more rich in symbolism than this one. This is just one symbol to represent the fear of the transition, fear of the unknown within the death that we are facing. I have never believed that death the death card, okay? Like it's always been, to me, it's always been like represented with such fear in movies and even in books that I've read about like a novel, I guess you could say a fiction novel that had tarot in it. It was always represented with this like great fear that came along with it. But I never thought of that. I always did think that there was some spiritual symbolic meaning to the death card, because it didn't make sense there would only be one death card and then there would be other bad or problematic cards in the deck. It just didn't make sense. There was so much symbolism with the other cards, so much deeper meanings. Why would this just mean bare death? So I never really got that. Now, it held the skeleton figure for me in most, I'll say the Rider-Waite, which was my mother deck, the one I started with, the Marseille and the Thoth, and even in this case, the mother piece, they all have skeletal figures. Now, for me, the skeleton is a match to the true self. It's kind of like a nod, a sense of the true self. It's without the skin and muscles, so therefore, this is our true self, the skeleton is, and the skin and muscles is what our ego is, and I guess in terms of what we're talking about in this Mindsight. Now the scythe is also a prominent figure in a lot of death cards, especially older death cards, but even modern death cards. People like to go back to this type of symbolism within this number 13 card. But the scythe isn't just an instrument of death, it's also an instrument of agriculture. And the scythe, in terms of symbolism, is a symbol of timing, divine timing. And I thought that that was really interesting, because much like the rose on the Rider-Waite deck, the scythe is all about, if you think about agriculture and then you think of the timing, then yes, that could go on like a Samhain, autumnal type of a time. But then what is that? That's a turning point. It's a transitional time of year. I think that that's just still nodding back to the transition we must face in the death of the ego and the dark night of the soul. The scythe being an agricultural symbol, it could symbolize what we need to harvest on the battlefield that is the mind. The battlefield that we must face in that spiritual warfare that I was talking about before. We have to scythe away all that we don't need. Cut away those parts of the ego. We do need parts of the ego to live in modern day society. There are things in the ego that may not be serving us, and we need to find out what that is. And that's what the scythe symbolizes here. Astrologically speaking, death is Scorpio, which is a fixed water sign, which to tarot practitioners, that is an emotional kind of a thing. And I always felt like with Scorpio, especially because we actually see that in the Thoth, which is the deck that I probably use the most, I guess I'll say, Crowley and Frieda Harris actually put the 3 levels of Scorpio in this card. Shedding snake, okay, that's on the ground. There's a nocturnal, painful scorpion, okay, the one that is gonna nick you. And of course, there's the freedom in divinity in the horizon of the eagle, which is up here on Osiris's crown. But with this being a fixed water sign, that just means that there's going to be a lot of emotional turmoil here. There's a fear of the change, but then there's going to be so much, you're going to be moody with this change. And that's okay. There's like an inner revolution that's going to be happening, which I think that's what the horizon in all of these cards symbolizes. This what we're going to get if we just wade through all this sludge. To me, the death card is a reality check. This is reality check at its most painful, and it's not as I don't think that the change is like this, like the Tower card. I believe that the Tower card is different in the way that this is a painful change, one we don't want to happen, one we don't know about. It's unknowable. But then the Tower card is a change that comes when we're least expecting it, and it could bring some upheaval, but there's not so much emotion, so much pain with it. So I feel like that's the difference between this problematic card, so to speak, and the Tower card. For me, this is a call to say something is not working. It'll be painful, but there's a horizon to look forward to. So I encourage you to get all of your death cards out if you want to and look at them with me and tell me what you see in the death cards. Do you see some more symbols that I didn't mention that could nod to the death of the ego or spiritual warfare or spiritual death in general? How has the death come up for you and it actually meant something, when you looked back at a reading in hindsight? Maybe something happened with a client with the death card that you still kind of think about. Let me know. I'd love to hear from you. And come back next new moon for some more Mindsight 2020. Much love, y'all.